Over the past 2 years, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has surprised many observers, critics, and even allies. The Dutertes, who were his key allies during the 2022 elections, have been quite upset, to put it mildly, with the direction of Philippine foreign policy in recent years. In particular, former President Rodrigo Duterte has repeatedly accused his successor of unduly provoking China, not to mention accusing Marcos Jr. of acting effectively as America's proxy. Meanwhile, liberal and progressive critics have been astounded by Marcos Jr.'s more uncompromising stance in the disputed areas, considering his more Duterte-like rhetoric during the election period. So how should we understand the shifting sands in Philippine foreign policy? And should the Philippines have a grand strategy that transcends the exigencies, the predilections, and the personal preferences of specific presidents or administrations? What should be the Philippines' grand strategy, and how should it relate to other major powers? Is the Philippines a middle power, and how can it best protect its interest in the 21st century? Oh, and by the way, there will be elections in the United States very soon. What are the implications for the Philippines? Will the return of someone like Donald Trump significantly affect the Philippines' position in this part of the world? Is there really a sustainable bipartisan consensus in the United States that the Philippines can rely on? Is America a reliable ally to begin with, considering its domestic political polarization and the shifting sands of America's own politics? To understand these issues, we have a special guest. Thank you very much, Professor, for joining us. Well, a lot has happened since we last spoke on this show and among other platforms. I want to talk about a lot of things. I mean, first of all, what is your reading of the U.S. elections in terms of the candidates, the midterm elections coming in the Philippines, in terms of the foreign policy aspect of this? But before that, Professor De Castro, let's talk about the West Philippine Sea. What have we learned over the past year or so since we have adopted a more proactive position, more proactively resisting China from the Transparency Initiative?
Okay, number one, of course, it exposed China's expansion and, of course, aggressive and coercive action against the Philippines, which, of course, generated strong public support for the current administration and also, of course, attracted the attention of primarily, of course, countries in the West, the United States, Japan, Australia, which it provided opportunity for the Marcos administration to strengthen, to revive its alliance and, of course, security partnerships with countries that, of course, are deemed as like-minded and, of course, there's an interest in preventing China's maritime expansion. On the other hand, it also exposed the limitation of the Transparency Initiative.
Right.
It's not enough, especially for a power, a great power like China, that is just simply bent on maritime expansion. It, at a certain point in its action in the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea, it couldn't care less about international public opinion, because the goal of China is, of course, control 90% of the South China Sea. Despite public opinion, China's goal is, number one, of course, effecting what I will call a de facto expansion. I would expand because I simply have the power. I have the largest navy in the world. I have the largest coast guard in the world. I have militarized many of those islands. I could use my economic statecraft to basically prevent, most of the ASEAN countries from raising hell regarding my maritime expansion. On the other hand, also, China's goal is, in a way, de jure, basically force us to accept the fact that China has the power, capability, and, of course, has this imaginary historic claim that it owns the South China Sea. So from the perspective of China, I have all the aces in my sleeves. You are just small powers. Remember what this Chinese Foreign Policy Counselor in July 2011 during the ASEAN Regional Forum meeting.
Vietnam,
ASEAN countries are small. China is a big power. This is something that, ASEAN countries would simply have to accept.
You're small and we're big.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, going back to this, Professor De Castro, to what degree has the strategy of the Philippines worked? Because at least it's a far cry from what we had during the Duterte administration, which obviously didn't work at all. If anything, further enabled and enticed China to double down.
Well, one thing, of course, again, this strong public support. I think there
which
is now
you need. It's important to have the domestic support.
It's also a realization of the fact that China's American expansion into the South China Sea is the quintessential security threat. Of course, it's a realization that in the defense, in the armed forces of the Philippines, now, of course, the general public is becoming aware of it. And again, going back to the 6 years of the Duterte administration, there's also a positive element. Just like I'm saying, the Duterte administration tried to appease China, but basically it also got a, basically uncompromising Chinese approach. And of course, China simply continued the expansion. So this is a point. Whether we appease China or challenge China, we get the same result. Subjugation, expansion. So this basically, at the end of the day, you realize, so what's the point of appeasing China? Might as well challenge China. Anyway, at least we have a chance of getting support from the international community. We could mobilize our public. And of course, at this point in time, we could think in terms of a grand strategy that could possibly give us a chance to constrain Chinese maritime expansion in the South China Sea. I'm talking about, of course, the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept.
We'll go to that, but it's very important that you mention that at least we have strategic clarity. Nagkakaalaman na, we know.
Yeah, we know
what is
we
out
call
there,
a spade.
and what we need to do as a
Yes.
nation. I think that's very important because you need that public support. When it comes to the Marcos Jr.'s administration, how do you understand these networks of partnership it's building? The reciprocal access agreement with Japan, also now potentially with New Zealand and France. Before we talk about the United States aspect, which is of course a big component of that.
Again, part of the grand strategy, if you look into the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, it basically accepts the fact that no matter how much resources we allocate for our defense, no matter how much resources we try to build our navy, our armed forces, we could never be on par with China.
Of course.
So we have to rely, of course, primarily on our treaty ally, the United States, and also security partners, especially the like-minded countries like Japan, Australia, South Korea, India, members of the European Union, members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and possibly even Taiwan. So at least we could get some diplomatic and certain degree, of course, limited military support. For example, at least from Japan is willing to export to us non-lethal military equipment like radar. South Korea, of course, is giving us, of course, opportunity to acquire a weapon system that we could afford, and of course, servicing agreement, and of course, possibly even if South Korean shipbuilding companies like Hyundai would start building up facilities here. This would basically facilitate, enable us to develop and produce, ships, naval warships that could be produced here in the Philippines.
So now what we have under the Marcos administration are two things, right? One is the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept, and the other one is, of course, this new law passed by President Marcos Jr. to build up our own domestic defense industry. How do you think these two are important to realization of the Philippines' defense strategy?
In the long run,
or what should we do rather in the long run?
In the long run, at least we have to develop a certain degree of autonomous defense capabilities in terms of building ships. At least we could build the platforms, but I don't think we have reached that level of industrialization where we could put everything there, radar, weapon system. At least as the most basic, we could start with the platforms like ships.
Right.
Later on, we would have to climb through the ladder and start building up an indigenous defense industry that could basically provide the industrial basis for this archipelagic defense concept.
And just for the purpose of our audience, what are we looking at in terms of archipelagic defense? Are we looking at developing ISR and domain awareness?
Yeah, that's
across
number
all our
one,
waters?
most basic. The maritime domain awareness. Then, of course, slowly we develop anti-access area denial capabilities.
Just like what China is doing to US.
China did. We start, of course, with acquiring a missile system, land-based missile system that could basically force the Chinese to think twice if they want to come closer to our shore. Then we start building at least, either we acquire or at least we build the platforms for corvettes, frigates, ships that we could use to basically impress upon the People's Liberation Army's Navy. Yes, you're big, but we can sink some of you. At least that gives us a fighting chance. Then as we slowly build up our naval capability, we slowly push the Chinese out of our exclusive economic zone. And of course, that will be supported by the Air Force and primarily a trilateral armed service. The Army, the Marines will have to play a role in providing us the most basic capability for this: anti-access area denial in form of land-based, surface to land-based missiles that we could basically show to the Chinese we have the capabilities to at least even damage or sink some of your ships that are operating within our exclusive economic zone.
So for the third horizon of the AFP modernization, something that you and I have been following for quite some time, what is your understanding of where we have been lacking and what should be the focus? So, because normally the idea is that the next step should be multi-role fighters, more warships,
Not just that, even
submarines.
the radar.
But now you're saying the missile game is very important here.
Drones.
Drones.
You just don't buy missiles.
Yeah.
You have to provide the support system for those missiles, ability
The
for you
radars
to
and all, yeah.
determine where those ships, trajectory, so for a lot. We have to basically start from the bottom because this entails basically a dramatic shift from the not only in terms of the outlook,
Yeah.
moving away from defending the island into our maritime domain. It also involves transforming the armed forces of the Philippines from being an army-centric
Army-based, yeah.
armed forces to one that is tri-service.
With more focus also, of course, on naval capability
Naval
and
capabilities.
Air Force, because we have shores as big as that of Russia, right?
Yeah.
Fifth, sixth in the world. Now, going back to this, Professor, what do you think? First of all, as someone who has been following the Philippines' defense policy and Philippines' civil military affairs for quite some time, do you think we're entering a historical juncture here, that this could be a beginning of a new era in Philippine defense strategy?
Well, as the old Chinese saying goes, a journey of 1,000 miles
Single step,
start with
yeah.
a single step. The single step, of course, involves two things. Number one, accepting the fact that Chinese maritime expansion is the quintessential threat to our national security. China is not a friend. It's an economic partner that, of course, has this expansionist agenda. And on the basis of this, even though we trade with the Chinese, we want Chinese investment. When it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to strategy, China poses a threat. This is something that this current generation of Filipinos and even future generations of Filipinos we have to accept. Nothing personal. As any great power in the world, you have, of course, your day where you will have to show to the world, I am the power to reckon with. Unfortunately, China has reached that point in time. In the third decade of the 21st century. Then, of course, the second element there is the realization that we have to come out with a grand strategy. Not simply in terms of developing your alliance, not only simply in terms of building up your defense industry, not only in terms of acquiring weapon system, not only in terms of building bases, reforming your armed forces. It's a grand strategy. It has to be long-term, and of course, accepting the fact every form of grand strategy has, of course, this acceptance that you are building up your capability because you have to use them. You have to use them in a situation, as Clausewitz would say, it's an extension of policy by other means, or what we call the ultimate election, which hopefully there's no need to get there. But we have to prepare for something that might happen unexpectedly and something that, of course, have dramatic impact on our nation.
Speaking of grand strategy, isn't it a bit pretentious for non-great powers to have grand strategy? But you think anyone, including Philippines, is a middle power, emerging middle
all
power?
countries have a form of grand power. Singapore has a grand strategy.
Yeah, active forward defense.
Defense.
Yeah.
Israel has a grand strategy.
Very similar.
So
yeah.
it depends on your size and depends also on your enemy, what you perceive as your potential. And all countries have a certain degree of grand strategy. South Korea has a grand strategy.
Right.
Taiwan has a grand strategy. Our grand strategy starts from the assumption of we have to focus on archipelago. We have to move away from simply defending the major islands like Luzon and also accepting the fact that we have to prepare for an asymmetric conflict.
Right, and that's where the missiles and everything comes in. Let me just slightly digress because I think for the usual critics of people like you and I who have been discussing about defense issues, they'll say, but you just admitted that China is an important economic partner. That the Philippines cannot unduly alienate China. We hear that from some of the major companies and business leaders in this country. What do you say to that kind of argument that we shouldn't be too confrontational to them?
Just look at China and Japan. China and Japan have close economic relations, but are they really friends? Or even look at Taiwan. Even look at China and the United States. So they might trade, trade might be very dynamic, trade
Yeah.
might be very important. But at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, politics and strategy trumps over economics. Especially when it's a matter of national survival, it's a matter of territorial integrity, it's a matter of ensuring that every Filipino will have access to the resources in their exclusive economic zone, which of course at this point in time, China is preventing us from doing so.
But speaking of that, you gave examples of the US and Japan, and we can even bring in India. A lot of these countries have already imposed restrictions. Some of them have banned TikTok in India or about to ban TikTok in the US, or at least it's planned. There are also a lot of restrictions on Chinese investments in critical infrastructure. Huawei and ZTE were pushed out of the American markets, and there are many areas of American infrastructure that is not open to China. Should the Philippines move in that direction too?
We don't have that huge economy, right? For example, India. I think we could simply start by diversification, by simply moving our focus and orientation slowly away from the Chinese market to other lucrative markets, like, for example, Japan, India, South Korea, Taiwan, and other countries in the region, ASEAN countries. So we should not simply put all our eggs in one basket. We have to distribute our eggs.
You think we're too
I don't think
interdependent
so.
with China?
Compared to the other ASEAN
We're not,
countries,
right?
we're not.
Exactly, because
We're
Japan
not.
and US are quite more
Yeah,
important
we're
to us.
as many ASEAN members, ASEAN member states would say, we're not part of the supply chain.
Exactly. Yeah.
A huge part of our wealth is actually generated from abroad,
Yeah.
from the remittances of Filipino OFWs and from business processing outsourcing, which is of course not
With the
linked with
US,
China, but
yeah.
with the US and other Western countries.
And not to mention semiconductors with Japan,
Semiconductor,
right?
yes.
So we're not. So what you're saying is that we're actually not that dependent on China to
compare
begin
probably to Malaysia,
Yes, or Thailand,
Thailand,
or Vietnam even.
Vietnam.
Right.
We have that leeway. I called it the leeway to irritate, antagonize China every now and then without being concerned about our economic ties with China.
What about positioning ourselves as an alternative, for instance, hub, in the sense of, maybe you don't want to have all your semiconductors done in
yes, of
Taiwan.
course.
Maybe you don't want your nickel all in Indonesia, which is dominated by Chinese companies. Do you think the Philippines should also play that game
of course.
of us as a source of
Yes, a
diversification
source of alternative
to China dominated
China, and
supply
basically
chains?
showing the world we need not simply worry about our economic relations with China. There are other options.
And don't you think, assuming we should care, that kind of pushes us away from the rest of the region, considering how the rest of Southeast Asia is on a very friendly diplomatic terms with China?
Well, we have to do what we have to do.
It is what it is.
Yeah. We're confronted by I call the quintessential threat to our national security, and that is, of course, Chinese maritime expansion into our maritime domain. A threat, of course, that Indonesia doesn't really take seriously. Malaysia, Singapore, it's only us. Again, that's a matter of I would call the curse of geography, where the smack of Chinese maritime expansion to the Western Pacific, and of course, complicated by the fact that we're a treaty ally of the United States.
Right. I mean, we have enough distance from China in a way that Vietnam doesn't have it, but you're absolutely right that there's still sufficient proximity for us to care about the threat. Now, speaking of the threat, of course, the other thing that makes Philippines exceptional is both the Taiwan question and South China Sea coincide.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like
we're in the middle of two geostrategic flashpoints.
and the
South
second
China
island
Sea,
chain just behind us.
yes, and South China Sea, and of course Taiwan. And I think at this point in time,
Yeah.
China has three core interests, which China announced way back in 2011.
Right.
South China Sea, Tibet, and of course Taiwan. But the Chinese, a number of the Chinese analysts and academics who I've met would always say, among the core interests is of course Taiwan, and we're the closest country to Taiwan.
Of course, yeah.
And of course, we have also interest in Taiwan.
250,000.
200,000
Yeah,
Filipinos. Proximity, geographic proximity, Batanes. If China would like to surround Taiwan, China would have to also take control not only of areas in the Pacific or the Taiwan Strait, or the Miyako Channel. They also have to take control of the Luzon Strait, and that will of course deprive us of our ability to have access even to the Batanes or even to our coastal area in the north.
Professor De Castro, I want to. This is quite a pointed question, but I want to ask this. Perhaps it's slightly academic, but I think it has relevance. Obviously, it looks like we cannot be neutral on what's happening in Taiwan because it's just right there, and we're a U.S. treaty ally. To what degree can the Philippines still hedge? Is hedging still possible for the Philippines, or alignment and being part of the U.S. integrated deterrence strategy is really the only way forward?
My take here is, limited alignment, hedging is a thing of the past. Our policy is primarily hard balancing.
That's it.
That's it.
We
We're
have
preparing
shifted.
for, the the negative, possible consequences of Chinese expansion into our maritime domain, China's effort to basically effect its irredentist agenda vis-a-vis Taiwan. We're preparing for, what they call it. If you talk about hard balancing, it basically means you're preparing for armed conflict.
So we have an alignment more or less with the U.S. on a lot of these issues concerning China, but we can still do performative hedging, right? Like rhetorically say we
Yeah,
still,
rhetorically, publicly deny that we are only doing it for
Yeah, defensive,
defense
yeah.
purposes. But all actions we do when it's come to no country would ever say, I'm doing an offensive action. Even China would
Yeah.
say, if China would, of course, effect its irredentist agenda against Taiwan, China would always say, I'm doing it for defensive purposes.
But the reason I asked that is, professors, because we keep on hearing independent foreign policy, non-alignment. These things pop up in Marcos' statements.
Independent because at the end of the day, we still make that decision. If we have to
We're
honor
not a
our
proxy.
treaty, If
I see
we
what
honor
you're
our
saying.
treaty commitment with the United
Yeah.
States, if we allow the United States to use those EDCA sites, if we have to send Filipino troops to facilitate the evacuation of Filipino OFWs in Taiwan, those decisions will be made by Filipinos, not by the Americans, not by the Japanese. It is still an exercise of our independent foreign policy. That's the very essence of independent foreign policy. Filipinos still have to make that final decision.
So autonomy and alignment are not mutually exclusive in
No,
that
of course. Yeah, autonomy, of course, lies on what's basically the room you have to maneuver.
Right.
Of course, it becomes limited as you have this, exigencies happening.
Right.
It limits you. Once you have a foreign policy crisis, that limits the time, that limits the options you have, and of course, given the military capability you have, limits our, I would call the strategic space, wherein we, of course, could exercise an independent or autonomous foreign policy decision.
I think that perfectly provides segue to this interesting drama. I don't know if the Cuban Missile Crisis is too much to put it, but I think both of us have independently used that metaphor.
Yes.
But are we moving towards that direction? Because what I get from the Chinese is initially they were like all drama about the Typhoon missile deployment here. We tried to wrap it under the under the rug, and then now we're openly saying we're open to it. And then suddenly we see some Chinese saying, "Oh, but that one Typhoon missile unit is not going to change anything."
Right.
Right.
I was in a conference early this year in Singapore where I heard a retired senior Chinese colonel telling the entire audience, including some Americans, China now has the largest navy in the world. So China has this sense of, we have the largest navy in the world. We have a shipyard that could produce more ships than the United States Navy. We have the largest Coast Guard in the world. We have this anti-access air denial. But those weapon systems, Chinese naval strategy, have not yet been tested.
Right.
So they haven't encountered what Robert Kaplan would call the Cuban Missile Crisis scenario or situation, wherein you would have to face your adversary in a classical Mexican standoff. Then you start thinking, am I capable? Am I have the military capability to simply overwhelm the other side? China has not yet encountered that situation. So we're seeing this.
Right.
Chinese creeping occupation, a Chinese sense of strategic hubris that they thought they've already won the game. They've already pushed out the 7th Fleet from the first island chain, that they basically can call the shots in ASEAN. China needs to encounter this moment where we have to reflect. Do I really have the strategic capabilities to alter the status quo?
And how important are these missile deployments? Because from my understanding is that's the best way for the U.S. to cancel out China's own
also
A2AD.
missile deployment, but I'm also suggesting, if I have a chance,
Right.
to talk with the U.S. Indo-PACOM commander, Admiral Samuel Paparo, I would also ask him, deploy more, attack submarines, nuclear-powered attack submarines. Like the same way as the United States is showing strategic deterrence to North Korea by deploying ballistic missile submarines and asking them to surface. We could also ask the 7th Fleet, send more ballistic, nuclear-powered attack submarines here, and have them surface every now and then, and basically telling China the Philippines will not only be a base for Typhoon missiles or HIMARS, you will have nuclear power attack submarines operating from here.
Wouldn't that violate SHUNFES, the ASEAN non-nuclear weapons free zone? I mean, don't you think that would create complications?
They're not technically they don't have nuclear weapons. They're only nuclear powered attack submarines that could fire cruise missiles, and of course tell the Chinese we could sink all your merchant ships and your navy ships down from Mindanao up to, of course, Luzon.
The reason I ask this is because it looks like some of our friends in Malaysia and Indonesia don't make that distinction between a nuclear-powered submarine and nuclear weapons.
To learn.
Yeah, exactly. Because the AUKUS, right? That's the context of AUKUS. Because Australia is that no, this is not a violation of NPT because it's not a nuclear weapons carrying submarine, right?
Yeah.
But it looks like some of our friends are not making that distinction.
They don't have any distinction, primarily because of the nuclear allergy. But you have to look at, if you're in strategic
But not to
studies,
China's. But when the Chinese send nuclear-powered submarines, they don't say anything.
They don't say anything. So it's also
hypocrisy, I would say, and selective criticism.
But we don't criticize our fellow ASEAN member states in public.
Let's see to it for the foreseeable future. But what do you honestly feel about the rest of ASEAN calling us the troublemakers, trying to say we are the American proxy or deputy?
Well, in a way, we have to make our decision. The 9, except probably with the exception of Vietnam,
right?
They are not faced what do I call the quintessential security challenge. In our case, we're confronted. They're right inside our maritime backyard.
Yep.
We see the operation of the Chinese Navy.
Front yard almost.
Front yard, and if they get Taiwan, it'll also be on our the Chinese People's Liberation Army's Navy, the Chinese Coast Guard, the Chinese Maritime Militia. They're all operating inside our exclusive economic zone. And I've been to Palawan about a month ago. They were also complaining that those Chinese ships are, of course, every now and then they would enter into our contiguous zone. That's about 24 nautical miles.
That's very close.
Very close to Palawan.
Very close.
And of course, they also have their artificial islands that they have practically militarized.
And this is, this is a threat to us in concrete terms, right? Because again, some of our friends would say, "Oh, but don't make a big deal." But this is about our fishery resources. This is about oil and gas development.
It's about ordinary Filipino fisher folks that are being driven away by guided missile, ships from the People's Liberation Army's Navy. Imagine using those guided missile fast attack craft all the way from Hainan Island just to drive away our ordinary Filipino fisher folks.
Yeah.
So this is something that no Filipinos could simply ignore.
No self-respecting
no self-respecting Filipino or patriotic Filipino would simply accept.
We'll talk about the not-so-patriotic ones soon. But first, let's talk about the U.S. elections. It's coming soon, and there are two sides of this debate, at least, right? One side is there's a bipartisan consensus for a long time, regardless of who becomes the next president. It's going to be a variation on the theme because we saw significant continuity from Trump to Biden. And then the other school of thought is, no, actually it matters who's still at the top of the chain in a sense that, Kamala Harris, for instance, has signaled that she's still invested in Ukraine's future. And that means that the U.S. will still be there. And as we speak, obviously the U.S. is also very much embedded in the conflict in the Middle East, which could even further escalate. And then at the same time, with the Trump administration, you have folks around him, including former National Security Advisor O'Brien, who openly said, Asia should still be the primary area of concern, and we should arm and help Philippines the way we're arming key allies like Israel, right? Which is not what you hear from the Kamala camp or even the Biden camp, for that matter. And then, but the counter argument would be, except, Trump could sleepwalk into a war with Iran as he almost did back in 2020. What is your read on that? Are you saying we don't know enough? Or what is the known? What is the unknown, if I can put it that way?
For one thing, of course, it's clear that they have a bipartisan consensus. I think in the U.S. Congress and even within the American national security establishment, in the National Security Council, in the State Department, in the Department of Defense, China is a clear and present danger. That has already been laid down just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2020. That's the reason why, of course, President Biden ordered the sudden withdrawal of American forces from Afghanistan. They were preparing basically for the showdown with China. Then, of course, Ukraine happened. So, of course, you have a shift in
Right.
the Biden administration. A result, you could not simply ignore what's happening in Ukraine. So, as a matter of, I would say, impromptu, the Biden administration adopted what I would call a more global strategy. We have, of course, to constrain both Russia
Multilateralist, yeah.
and China. Well, the Trump administration is saying, that it might adopt what I would call a selective engagement, focused primarily on Asia, try to cut the deal with Russia,
To
which of course
isolate
will have
China.
what of course will have an implication. This will mean basically the United States would lose credibility in NATO
Europe.
and the European
Yeah.
Union, and this might lead also to less European involvement in the Indo-Pacific region.
Because they have to pick up the
Yeah,
bill, yeah.
But that's basically happening at the realm of the election right now. But at the end of the day, once you have either a Kamala Harris or a Donald Trump up there, they would have to listen to the advice of the what I would call the national security establishment.
And you don't think Trump will purge them, all
Oh
of this
no,
conversation?
Trump might be concerned with other issues.
Domestic issues.
And he might, probably there's might be health issues that might affect him
Yeah,
given
I
his
mean,
age.
he's not at the prime in many ways. But aren't you worried, Professor De Castro, about U.S. domestic politics affecting its foreign policy if this polarization gets even more
Well, but
intensified?
one thing will unify this highly polarized American society. They needed enemies.
Right.
The enemies,
Right.
of course, provided by no less than China.
And there you see public opinion is very
Public
clear,
opinion, yeah.
way ahead of everyone else. I
Yeah.
think Russia, Iran, North Korea don't
Yeah,
come
the
even close.
sort of national hysteria
Yeah.
that has been generated, of course, by Chinese action and, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes. So it's a
You know,
combination of prejudice
prejudice
and
and,
jobs
jobs
and
and,
national security.
Yes, of course, also activities of many Chinese individuals in the
Right.
United States.
Right. The infiltration,
The
fears from the
infiltration,
border.
and also what the Chinese are doing against U.S. treaty allies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. This has basically galvanized American public opinion against China.
So what is the known unknown that perhaps we should look out for?
At this point, that I cannot simply think of anything. Who basically the decision whether again, and this is always an age-old
Yeah.
dilemma in the United States. Ever since, of course, the United States, ever since, of course, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Right.
What should always be the priority, Europe or Asia?
Professor Castro, obviously there's another election coming up also not long from now, which is the Philippines midterm elections. In fact, you can say the election has already started with a certificate of candidacy actually filed earlier in the month. Could this be the first midterm elections where actually foreign policy matters to a certain degree? Because you saw surveys, for instance, like
Pulse
Okta,
Asia.
Pulse Asia and
Asia.
Okta.
Let's see. Yeah,
That
again.
says, that people are looking at who's the pro-China or pro. I mean, I think in one survey, was it Okta, only 5% said they'll support someone who's pro-China, right? Which is quite an interesting thing to hear. And more than 70%, I think, were much more positively predisposed to someone who takes a tougher stance on China. Do these surveys tell us anything, or is there anything new that's happening here?
Let's see. It has to be tested. Let's wait until the people cast their ballots. Whether foreign policy indeed would be a key issue in this midterm election. It's simply so difficult to predict, given the fact that election will be how many more months before we have that.
Yes.
Again, this is a thing about democracy. Just like going back to Forrest Gump, it's, opening a box of chocolate, you simply don't know what you'll get.
Well, I'm always for Forrest Gump wisdom. The reason I'm asking this, Professor De Castro, is that you have interesting cases whereby, for instance, Senator Tolentino, who was the political advisor to Duterte, now essentially campaigning on a very strong West Philippine Sea positioning,
see,
right?
entitled to do
I mean, this is
so.
quite new. I mean, I don't remember any other midterm elections, even back in 2013, right,
Yeah.
after Scarborough, when it was as much front and center, or tagging of certain.
Yeah, then we can give credit, of course, to the Transparency Initiative of the government, and of course,
That's what I was talking about, right?
the president, the president himself, taking a very strong pro-Filipino, very strong patriotic stand when it comes to the West Philippine Sea, South China Sea issue.
And the reason I'm asking this is because,
And of course, we also have to give credit to China.
thanks to China making their own case more difficult.
The fact
yeah.
that it's so uncompromising position, it's coercive action, and it's blatant expansion into our maritime domain.
The Pulse Asia survey commissioned by ADR Institute showed that China has the lowest, even lower than Russia.
Yeah.
Right. And Russia's just invaded another country. Right.
Yep.
So that tells you what a climb China has to make. But Speaking of China, are you worried about malign influence operations?
Oh, they're doing it. Of course, we know. Yeah,
and
every
and in
day.
terms of getting worse.
Yes, but again, they have to surmount this very intense anti-China public opinion. So they're going against the wave. Interestingly, even during the Duterte administration,
Right.
where you have an administration that's hell bent on appeasing China, public opinion was still, of course, very skeptical of, extremely contemptuous of China. So this is something that I think that's been built up,
Right, over time.
for several generations, going back probably as far as in the 1960s during the Cold War.
Or going back to the Spanish period.
Even
even 17th century.
The notion of the Parian.
Yeah.
That Chinatown should be under the shadow of the Spanish guns.
Yeah. So I mean that tells you this goes deep.
This go deep in our history.
Although thankfully we don't have the kind of pogroms and all that a lot of our neighbors have been having. The racial the conflicts
Well,
and all.
interestingly, I still remember my late professor Renato Constantino, because some of those Chinese eventually were intermarried and they create a new strata in
Right.
colonial Philippines.
Mestizos,
The Chinese mestizos, who
Yeah.
are also very contemptuous of the Chinese.
Yeah. They're very patriotic. Rizal.
They're
I mean,
patriotic,
like
with
Rizal,
Rizal,
yeah.
but at the same time, they don't consider themselves as Chinese.
Yes.
They are also very suspicious of the Chinese. They set themselves apart from
Yes.
their Chinese ancestry and basically created the notion of the mestizo.
Right.
I still remember the late.
I mean, they're Catholics. Yeah, they're Catholics. Hispanic,
Spanish
Americanized.
educated, and
Yeah.
of course, not really anti-Chinese, but very contemptuous
Right.
of the Chinese because they have not been converted to Catholicism. They still maintain their way of life.
Yeah.
Whereas this Chinese mestizo strata has basically assimilated with themselves first with the colonial powers, then later on became heroes, became leaders of the nationalist movement. So that's a particular case about our history. Still remember?
That's important. That's important because, I think one of the worries out there is that this really PRC, Zhonghai kind of sentiments could kind of have a blowback in terms of affecting our treatment of our fellow Chinoy
Yeah,
brothers
no,
and
we have
sisters.
to understand that.
Exactly,
The role of the Filipino Chinese in our history cannot be ignored.
Positive
And
role,
of course,
patriotic
positive,
role.
and the fact that those Filipino Chinese are basically the bedrock of Philippine nationalism during the formative years in the. I'm not an historian, but I cannot help but remember our lesson.
We're amateur as amateur historians.
Under
yeah.
the late Renato Constantino, Professor Renato
I mean,
Constantino.
we had Senator Gatchalian, very proud Chinoy, who
Yeah.
was talking about national security, protecting our patrimony,
Or-
exposing Alice Go,
and the late Benigno Aquino III.
Of course,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think this is an important thing to say. Having said that, what should we do in terms of strengthening our national whole of nation resilience to malign influence? Because we had cases of cheap fake, if I can call it, not deep fake. This disinformation attempts that have been supported by China based on the report we saw by ASPI. We also had a representative from Department of DTI here in our show who said that they know that China is involved in pushing for certain disinformation and propaganda against President Marcos and other officials. What should we do about that?
I think, of course,
we
domestically.
need a new law? New
no,
law?
we don't need a new law. We need political action. Number one, of course,
Right.
here we gathered Filipino analysts, journalists, academics, who, of course, will take the strong patriotic position, and also have cooperative activities with other countries that, of course, have been targets of Chinese malign influence
Australia,
operation.
Taiwan.
Canada,
Yeah.
Taiwan, Japan, Australia, the United Kingdom, and other countries in Europe. So we should have this sort of a coalition of countries that would take into account the fact that Chinese malign influence operation in the country also presents a clear and present danger, especially when it comes to the notion, of course, of cognitive warfare.
Right.
Because for the Chinese, warfare is not only in terms of actual warfare, warfare should also happen within the cognitive domain.
Right.
Going back to Sun Tzu, Art of War.
And psychological warfare is
Warfight,
something very important with the three wars doctrine of China. Last part, Professor De Castro, what do you want to see in terms of Philippines' grand strategy? I mean, if in a pedagogical way, over the next 10, 20, 30 years, what are the things that you think should come together for the Philippines to be a full-fledged middle power, self-respecting power?
We have to link this grand strategy with economic and industrial development.
Right.
The same way as I just came from South Korea, the same way as
Right.
South Koreans' effort to basically build up their
Right.
defense industry
Right.
also provided an important impetus for national industrialization. Or we go back to Japan during the Meiji
Right.
period.
Right.
Strong country, strong army, rich country. So we have to think along that line. The clear and present danger that China presents to us as it expands in the South China Sea should be a major impetus not only in building up our comprehensive archipelagic defense structure,
But
in
defense
terms of-
industry, yeah.
but the defense industry, which of course will be the basis of our country's industrialization and development, and would of course transform us not only into a militarily powerful middle power, but also a middle power with comprehensive capabilities.
And I think from South Korea to Turkey, we
Turkey,
see. I mean, Turkey is a drone
Or
superpower. Yeah, Taiwan for
Taiwan.
that matter, right?
So
These are templates we can
Yes.
use.
Yeah, that's it.
And what about the whole of nation approach? What are the things we need? Do we need? We're educators, both of us.
Educators, we need, of course,
Curriculum. You think?
curriculum,
Yeah.
business models, even in terms of infrastructure development, should be linked with national security agenda. Everything will have to be linked with building up our comprehensive archipelagic defense concept capabilities, our comprehensive capability that could enable us to really realize the goal of the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept.
And in terms of weapon systems and all, it should be a mix of missiles and
Missiles,
A2AD.
and primarily, of course, shipbuilding. The most crucial element will be shipbuilding because we have to build up our naval capabilities, not only in terms of the Philippine Navy, but also the Philippine Coast Guard.
Last point, Professor De Castro. What gives you hope about the Philippines? I mean, you have been covering these issues longer than most of us, right? And you have a huge body of work on this. What gives you hope? What have you noticed in terms of positive trajectory over the past?
Well, at least
20?
this administration, the fact
Right.
that this administration had made the crucial decision that, number one, we have to accept the fact, the reality that we cannot simply focus on domestic concerns. There's a great power out there in our maritime domain that is expanding closer and closer to our shore. Sooner than later, we would see them asking our permission every time our ship would leave the Manila Bay or go out of corridor and ask him, this is our territory, you have to ask our permission. And the second point, of course, is we have to think in terms of developing a grand strategy geared, of course, in ensuring that we could protect not only the main islands of the Philippines, but our archipelagic domain.
On that positive note,
Okay,
thank you very
Richard,
much,
thank you very
Professor.
much, Richard.
I hope this inspires a new generation of strategic thinkers who will do this
Hopefully.
grand strategy for the next
Hopefully.
generation or so. Thank you so much,
Hopefully.
Professor. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcasts. I'm Richard Haydarian, and that was The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.